Okay, this video we're talking with Dan Angus on his work on tuning machines. I know Dan, we've spoken to you elsewhere in the course before. If you're interested in finding out about Dan, you can read about him here and click on the links to some of his other work. So we're talking here, Dan, about a particular paper of yours about tuning machines. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this has been a really fun program of work that I've done with Nick Carra and also with Jean Burgess. And through this, we've been really interested in the ways that machine vision systems are part of our everyday lives. And so how they've very much been inserted within the social media platforms we use, like particularly platforms like Instagram, and then how this impacts on the ways in which we as the humans and the users of these platforms may be adjusting our behaviors on account of the algorithmic logics that are beginning to be embedded within those systems. So it's really that duality between the ways in which the platform itself organizes around these algorithms and embeds them, but also how our users ourselves are then responding to this and maybe adjusting our everyday practices to suit those logics in some way. And then, of course, this is a two-way feedback, right? So it's that constant kind of dance between both, where one is pushing, the other's pulling, and then it's going back and forth. And so, yeah, we're really interested in that, but
Mhm.
also particularly, and I think this is driven from Nick's interest more than anyone, is the ways that that is also entrenching particular commercial logics, right? So advertising and how that plays a role, and the role of machine vision, particularly within that kind of promotional logic as well.
Yeah. And you built tools, digital tools to do some of this work, right?
Yeah, so that was a key part of it was that, and the argument is going right back to the start of the project, I'm thinking more than 10 years now, actually, was that we were unsatisfied with just doing a theoretical take,
Mhm.
or perhaps just a simple empirical take where we might just survey people on their views. We wanted to deeply simulate how these systems work because our argument is we can't mount a proper critique and a cultural studies led critique of these systems unless we know intimately how they work. So we could build simulated versions of them to experiment and play with them and to really use that to inform our theorization and our work in understanding their role.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us a little bit about the machine vision and social media and what you were doing.
Yeah, so it's been a long shift, right? Over like a decade or more now, where we've seen in certain social media platforms the growth and in fact the embeddedness and now just like this is commonplace and we couldn't really imagine probably the platforms without it of machine vision within those platforms.
Mhm.
And so, casting our minds back to the days when social media platforms were organized mostly through temporal feeds, there was very little of this form of content recommendation to a moment now where every kind of touch point of ours in those systems is being traded through or mediated through some form of algorithmic logic. That's been an ongoing shift.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, what we know now is that it's not just simple, like straightforward input output deterministic logic of like, okay, I am a white male in my, middle age. I live in Brisbane. So therefore an advertiser will select those check boxes and deliver me advertising. Rather, it's the idea of the sum total of my data points. So my friendship circles, what they're doing online, activity points I'm providing through my use of the platform, the kind of media I'm uploading, or everything you can possibly datify is being used to create a profile for me and a
Yeah.
mathematical profile for me. And now what these systems are using is proxies, right? So these mathematical proxies to then figure out how to target advertising and figure out what content is appearing in my feed. And so this deep enmeshment and embedding of machine vision within these systems is crucial to this because so much of what we're sharing or doing online is visual by nature now. It's photos, it's videos and such.
And you can see, like in there, it's kind of how this contributes towards the commercialization of everyday life. What
Absolutely.
what does that mean in terms of the note there about convergence of public and personal?
Yeah, so the idea of like, at one point we had a fairly ring-fenced idea of our personal, right? The conversations we'd have with others, the ways in which our personal life versus our very public, I'm here out there doing my very public facing things. That we've seen this completely blurred now,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So there's no real barriers between and boundaries between like for me as, someone who's out there as a public intellectual, say, and as a professor and do that versus me riding my bicycle
yeah,
or complaining to the council about a pothole on my roads. So that idea of all
yeah,
these things are just blurring through.
yeah. Okay. Okay. So, yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what we have here?
Yeah, so this back, and again, casting back to when we first started to see machine vision systems and others used in social media, there was this real concern about them through this lens of bias. So the idea that, and if you remember when I was talking last time about the ways we train the system, like the cat example, you
Mm.
get your data set of cat images and not cat images, you
Yeah.
train and you get above a certain threshold and you say, okay, it is learnt. That's supervised machine learning. So
Hmm.
it's where you've got a defined target of cat or not cat or something like that, and
Yep.
you're training a system to do that. Unsupervised machine learning is a little bit different because it's not worried so much about a deeply known category. It's rather saying, can you take a range of data and just sort it roughly into groups? And
Yep.
these groups don't necessarily even have labels. We just know that they might hang together in a particular way. So they have an affinity, they contain similar kinds of iconography or similar kinds of aesthetic, values and norms. And it may be possible to group them together. And that's the driving logic behind unsupervised machine vision, where you don't have a target. Instead, what you do is you have the system define groups and say, you know, yeah, I'm going to anthropomorphize it, but like I think that these photos go together in
Yeah.
some
So
way.
it goes from like having a predefined set of things to look for to allowing the machine to kind of decide the categories of how it's going to put things together.
Precisely.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's a profound shift
Yeah.
because where the previous critique had been, well, what happens if we're biased in the setting of the categories? The concern around unsupervised machine vision becomes very different because it's a different set of logics now that we have to really understand. It's
Mm.
not that the machine is necessarily imposing a set category, rather it's emerging these other categories which reveals different kinds of things and perhaps different kinds of concerns about the way that it's doing that and finding those associations.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Second. So you have a kind of
What the hell is this,
hologram
right?
representation of it here.
So
Yeah.
look, I had to throw this one in because it helps you make sense of what's going on here. What we have here is at the front of it is the Snoop Dogg dogs from Splendor in the Grass, right? This is
Yep.
an art installation. So it's an image. It's been reduced down to 224 by 224 pixels. And the multiplied by three there is because you've got red, green, and blue color channels, right? So this is like a standard bitmap image file. And so we had a bunch of these and from Splendor in the Grass from Instagram. And what we did was we fed them into this very, very classic convolutional neural network. This is like bog industry standard neural network called VGG16. And what it does is it feeds that image through this trained network. And it's basically squashing it. So at every point, what it's doing is remembering that architecture and those layers of neural networks I was talking about. Each one of these little boxes is like one of those layers.
Mhm.
And what it's doing and what you need to kind of notice here is it's taking it from like a flat image and it's squishing it and extruding it like spaghetti, right? It's like you're pushing a big blob of dough through a spaghetti machine and it's making it long at the end. And so at the very end of this, what you end up with is 1,000 numbers, right? What we call a feature vector. So it's 1 by 1 by 1,000, which means it's just a long list of 1,000 numbers. And those 1,000 numbers represent that image that we've fed in.
Yep.
And the thing here is that if I had other images like the Snoop Dogg dogs, I might expect that the numbers at the end, those 1,000 that feature vector, would be similar for that other one. And
Mhm.
this is the point. What we're doing here is a process called embedding, where you're taking a very rich media object and you're trying to represent it through the use of one of these neural networks as just a long string of numbers.
Yep.
But those numbers have a meaning. That those dimensions don't necessarily mean anything, right? In this case, they do. They do respond to categories. but they don't have to,
Yeah.
right? And but the point here is that you've converted an image to a number.
And so why did you need to do that in the analysis you were doing in this project?
Because this is exactly how Instagram operate on the images that we feed. So when we feed images into Instagram or other social media platforms, often those images are being fed through these kinds of processes. And so
Yep.
what happens is that image then has associated with it a vector of these numbers. And then what you'll have is an ability for Instagram to then be able to know something about you and your tastes and likes. So
Yep.
when you go to your For You page, it might be able to recommend you content similar to what you've been posting about.
Yeah. So very broadly there, that what it takes the things that you're engaging with or you've posted, turns it into those numbers, and then tries to match your feed using,
To
correlating them.
those.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Or uses that to target advertising,
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And and so one of the things, yeah, we found here also is by going into sites like festivals, it's very interesting because they have very Instagrammable objects and
Yeah.
enclosures, right?
So
So
you
we
kind of
noticed.
discover that there's particular numbers that are Instagrammable, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so we see these, but what we see is them recurring in the system. And so the point here is like we went in this, we didn't label this data. We didn't say, oh, this picture of, the wilds, which was an advertising installation, and say, and give it text and enrich it. We just took the images, put them through one of this VGD16 algorithm, and at the other end, we looked to see if you could actually find clusters. And the
Mm.
machine was very, very good at clustering these around these broadly aesthetic groupings, and in fact, in many cases, grouping around the same kinds of objects.
Yeah.
And that says something about its ability to go beyond just simple classification of going, oh, that is a statue or that is a stage, to now being able to attend towards more of the very aesthetically or underlying values and kind of the gaze that we have as
Yeah.
users in a very, very different way.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay. So tell us what's going on
So
here.
yeah, that is exactly one of the examples. So
Clusters.
what you're seeing here is a bit of, and it's a bit complicated, but there's like a visualization there in the top corner, and that's from our system that kind of laid these things out in this kind of broad hierarchy. And when you look into this particular cluster, you find all these clusters of the Snoop Dogg dogs, which was this art installation. And what you see there is, for each of those, you see a group like some are close up, some are kind of more far away. Some have got people in them, some don't have people in them,
Mhm.
and so each of those clusters is doing that slightly differently.
Mm. Yeah. 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 So, why is this important? What's the significance of this in terms of what you're looking for in your study?
The point here is like we did not label any of these. We did not discern any of these. Like we did not do anything to the system to try and train it towards being able to recognize Snoop Dogg dogs.
Yeah.
It did this having never seen these kinds of images before, but it was able to bring them together to be able to actually align them
Mm.
as whole clusters,
Yeah.
right? And that was the point, right?
Yeah.
Is that it is able to do this and able to cluster these things this way.
Yeah. And then the discovery of these clusters allows you to kind of think a little bit about how the algorithm then works to recommend things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about the kind of different categories that the machine produced?
Poses and perspectives. So basically we created sorry, Steve, can you just give me 1 second? I'm just hearing something out here. Can I
Yeah, sure.
pause?
Yeah, I'll just pause it.
Sorry, mate. I'm back.
Okay, we're back just after Dan needed a quick break there to go and check out what was going on in his house. So
It's
yeah,
fine.
tell us about the poses and perspectives category.
Yeah, pose and perspectives. So basically, the idea here is that at a festival like Splendor in the Grass, what you have is a bunch of different kinds of aesthetic production, right? So you've got, yeah, lots of photos of the stage. You've got lots of photos of like Snoop Dogg dogs and other art installations.
Hmm.
You've also got festival goers themselves in very particular poses. I mean, this was like in a moment when those red American style beer cups were very popular and
Yeah.
things like that. And you see them feature and, even the ways that, selfie taking, the particular angles and the particular backdrops there, they have a particular meaning in that moment
Yeah.
that is very different to the kinds of production practices we would see today. And we were astounded at how well this unsupervised classifier was able to group those.
Hmm. Right.
Again, reminding everyone we did not explicitly train it towards those kinds of poses or
Yeah.
perspectives. It was able to find them itself. And
Yeah.
again, this shows the profound power of those systems in how they can make sense of previously unseen forms and aesthetics.
Yeah. Okay. So there was like it found various poses and perspectives.
Yeah, so yeah, this is with the red
Here's the
cup,
red
right?
cups. Yeah, they're kind of so
Yeah.
it was essentially finding, common symbols that it was then grouping things together around.
Yeah, and this was like there was a practice at the time. I mean, maybe your students might find this cringe today, but like back then it was very much the done thing of particularly young female presenting festival goers doing this in this way that like, but particularly on the street, right? So
Mm.
you've got these long leading lines of all the, you see the cars parked there, almost the identical location for
Yep.
all of these individuals, right? So a particular spot that they've all kind of found to do this. And like these are not individuals that are necessarily known to each other. They're just visible in the data set. And you can start to see, yeah, the emergence of a very particular kind of aesthetic.
Mm. Mm. So there's a perspective in promiscuous clustering. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so the idea is that again back to that point that this is not data that's labeled, right? It's promiscuous in the sense that it kind of emerges out of the data set in a way. And so yeah, it's not that these are practices that are that are identified or labeled, but they can be found.
Mm.
And like we found them in the system, and we found this through the use of that embedding model. And it means that the platforms can also find these and it can
Yep.
use them to associate, to label in their own ways, to target forms of advertising, and to figure out and make judgments about individuals and their shared likes or interests.
Yep. Okay. So moving a bit more towards to thinking a bit more conceptually here, what should we understand about machine vision entanglements?
Yeah, so this goes now to like work particularly by Maria Gemma Brown, who is one of the PhD students in the project. And Maria has done a huge amount of work on vibes. And it's that idea that like I really like the conceptualization of vibes. We all do. It really helps make sense of this. Is that what we've got now is and how we need to understand the logics of machines is that often now it's you're talking about categories that escape classification through more traditional means. And so when we're talking about particularly in Instagram, what Maria was finding through case studies like we're looking at cores, so like cottage core and
Mm.
other goblin core and all these
Yep.
like these certain practices at the time, was
Aesthetics.
that when you see what it is and you see the images together, you can get at what the vibe of it is. It's not that they all have the same objects. It's not like there's any kind of reference to the same things. Rather, it's the vibe. It's the
Mm.
entire sum total of the image, its composition, the light and the contrast, all of those elements taken together that produce this idea of what a vibe is. And what was interesting to us is that mathematically you can create a representation of a vibe.
Yep.
And that's something that at the time particularly had cultural studies academics hadn't really considered that, right?
Mm.
That the machine vision systems were able to capture that kind of essence, that vibe. They thought of them as fairly dumb machines that could only do stuff if you were pre-training them or doing that quite directed.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Um, so moving towards the end here, like, oh, what have I done there? Sorry, I've go back.
Yeah, you're right, Stephen.
Can you still see the thing?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I can still see it.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is really about the way that, and I've done this a little bit, I think, through today, is talk about that history of media technology.
Hmm.
And that's where we need to be really attending to is that idea now of algorithmic shaping is that, this machine vision work that we're seeing right now. And of course, now we're seeing the next shift of this now with synthetic content and the way that that's kind of working through our feeds. That the key aspect, and this is really key also for the generative stuff now, is how fundamental we as users have been to that process.
Yep.
And so it's us that have been providing the data and co-creating that understanding with the machine. So it's not just about me also just creating an image and sharing on Instagram. It's about the feeds that we have created. And in many of these cases, we're talking about people who've done a huge amount of work, a huge amount of labor in training these machines through their everyday posting and practices around sharing and tagging and commenting within these spaces. And so that's just to think about that this is not something that just happens in one moment, but it's
Yep.
actually something that happens over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also, I think goes more into probably what you're going to talk about with Nick and maybe with Amy as well. But that idea of how bodies as well are very central in this, and how
Yes.
those technologies also can be used to suppress, to kind of police and to monitor, to surveil,
Yep.
and how that also comes into the frame with these.
Yep. Okay. What's going on here? I can't get it to move on to the next one. So I think just that we're getting towards the end. So I think the way I want to conclude is to get you to just maybe reflect a little bit about summing up what's important here in a few sentences, and maybe a little bit of a kind of description of what's going to happen next in this space, do you think?
Yeah, so the big take home point here is that I don't think this is as much a thing anymore in our understanding of this, but it certainly was when we were doing the work, was to really contend with the idea of associative logics.
Hmm.
So, whereas previously I think we understood the roles of algorithms in a far more, that supervised classification style approach of like when I gave the example of the advertising, that like I am an ad buyer and I want this ad to be seen by this kind of person demographically fitting these kinds of gender, age,
Yep.
income level, whatever. The systems that we have now, because of the manner in which they've been trained and the manner in which they've been enmeshed in these social media architectures, is that they're driven through the logics of association.
Hmm.
And so it's about the sum total of our interactions, our posting, the ways in which we consume, so that what we're scrolling and attending to when we're watching things. And it's not just that, it's also the networks we're in. So it's as much about the people we're spending time with because these
Yep.
are geolocative. The sum total of all of that is being fed through these systems to create these long vectors, right? These
Yep.
numbers. We are being reduced, and all this complexity is being corralled down into these vectors and these numbers, which can be used to embed us in this big space. And
Mm.
that space can be used to, yeah, recommend content, to target advertising, to guess things about us. And that's what we need to contend with is like when it actually escapes a category definition, where it can get at the vibe. It doesn't need a label. It
Yep.
can now actually appropriate a vibe. We're in a very different space than we were 5, 10 years ago.
Yeah, we're kind of approaching like a politics of the vibe in a way in the future. Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And yeah, and how do you moderate a vibe and how do
Yeah.
you think about that and really push back against it if that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I want to leave people is that idea of avail yourself of the notion that these things are labeling us,
Yeah.
right? They're not. They're representing us
Yeah.
in through these very dense vectors, and using that logic of association to determine the kind of content that we might be fed.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks so much for your time again, Dan. Appreciate it.
No worries, Stephen.